while the entire world had its eyes fixed on Japan, watching rescue crews dig through the rubble of a devastating earthquake that had just torn through Kumamoto Prefecture, a much quieter story was unfolding 6,000 miles away, on the opposite side of the Pacific, where the ground beneath California had already begun its own restless year of shaking. It didn't make the same headlines. Nobody's home collapsed on live television. But for the scientists who spend their careers watching the fault lines running beneath one of the most seismically dangerous states in America, 2026 had already turned into one of the more unsettling years in recent memory, and the timing of it all, quietly unfolding in the shadow of a much bigger disaster overseas, only made the pattern easier for most people to miss entirely. Start with the basic geography, because it explains almost everything else. California sits directly on top of the boundary between two of Earth's massive tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, grinding past one another along a colossal fracture in the Earth's crust known as the San Andreas. Fault. That fault alone stretches roughly 800 miles from the Salton Sea in the south all the way up past the Bay Area and beyond, and it doesn't move smoothly or gradually. It moves in fits and starts, locking, up for decades or centuries at a time, while stress silently accumulates, then releasing that stress all at once in sudden, sometimes catastrophic ruptures. But the San Andreas isn't operating alone out there. It's flanked and crisscrossed by dozens of smaller related fault systems: the Hayward Fault, the Rogers Creek Fault, the Macama Fault, the Calaveras Fault, the San Jacinto Fault, the Imperial Fault, each one capable of triggering earthquakes in its own right, and each one tied in some geological sense to the same underlying tectonic engine driving the larger San Andreas system. When people talk about California shaking, they're rarely talking about just one single fault. They're talking about an entire interconnected network of stressed moving crust stretching the length of the state. By the time the Kumamoto earthquake struck Japan on the 28th of July 2026, California had already logged a genuinely unusual run of seismic activity across multiple corners of that network. Activity that, taken individually, might not have seemed alarming, but that, taken together, painted a picture seismologists were watching closely. It started early in the year. In January of 2026, a magnitude 4.9 earthquake struck north of Indio in the Coachella Valley, rattling residents across the region and serving as what local emergency officials described at the time as a stark reminder of the importance of earthquake preparedness. That quake was followed by a series of aftershocks over the following days, and then, just weeks later, on the 1st of February, a magnitude 3.3 earthquake struck again near Indio, in almost exactly the same area. A second reminder that the underlying stress driving that January event hadn't simply vanished once the initial shaking stopped. Barely a day after that, seismic attention shifted hundreds of miles north to the San Francisco Bay Area, where a cluster of at least 19 earthquakes, the largest registering magnitude 4.2, shook the city of San Ramon on the 2nd of February. Residents across the Greater Bay Area, a region already famous for living with the constant low-level hum of seismic risk, felt the shaking ripple through their homes and workplaces. Another data point added to a growing tally of unusual activity strung out across the state's major fault systems within the very same winter. Spring brought no real relief. On the 2nd of April, a magnitude 4.6 earthquake struck near Boulder Creek, in the Santa Cruz Mountains, southwest of San Jose, an area sitting directly along another segment of the greater San Andreas system, one that famously ruptured catastrophically back in 1906 during the earthquake that devastated San Francisco. More than 25,000 separate reports of shaking poured into the United States Geological Survey following that April quake, with residents feeling the tremor as far away as Sacramento and Fresno, a testament to just how efficiently seismic waves can travel through California's particular geology once a fault finally lets go. Then, in May, the activity intensified even further, this time concentrated in the Brawley Seismic Zone, a tectonically restless stretch of crust sitting between the southern terminus of the San Andreas Fault and the northern end of the Imperial Fault, just south of the Salton Sea. Beginning early, on a Saturday morning in mid-May, more than 350 separate earthquakes rattled the area around the city of Brawley within the span of roughly a day and a half, an outburst seismologists refer to as a swarm, a cluster of earthquakes of broadly similar size and intensity without any single larger main shock, leading the sequence the way a more typical earthquake and aftershock pattern usually unfolds. Two of those Brawley swarm quakes registered magnitude 4.5 and 4.7 respectively. And while officials reported no significant damage or injuries, the sheer scale of the swarm, hundreds of distinct earthquakes crowding into such a short window, was enough to draw renewed national attention to a region long known for exactly this kind of unpredictable clustered seismic behavior. Seismologist Lucy Jones, one of the most widely respected earthquake experts in the country, explained at the time that this kind of swarm activity is genuinely typical for the Brawley seismic zone specifically, a network of small, interconnected faults linking the southern San Andreas to the Imperial Fault, an area long recognized as unusually prone to producing these kinds of tightly packed earthquake clusters. Geophysicist Andy Michael, tracking the same swarm for the United States Geological Survey, pointed to the region's unusual geology as part of the explanation, noting that shifting underground fluids tied to the area's active geothermal energy production can lubricate and stress nearby faults simultaneously, releasing that accumulated pressure through a steady stream of smaller earthquakes rather than a single, larger rupture. It's a pattern that has played out in this same stretch of desert before, including a notable swarm back in 2012 that eventually produced a magnitude 5.4 earthquake. And researchers were careful to note that while these swarms are a well-understood, largely normal feature of the region's geology, they remain, in their own words, a good reminder of the importance of ongoing earthquake preparedness. By early June, the seismic spotlight had shifted again, this time to Sonoma County in Northern California's wine country, where a magnitude 3.6 earthquake struck near the town of Cloverdale on the 2nd of June, centered directly along the Makama Fault, a major active strike-slip fault that runs north from the area around Santa Rosa toward Ukiah. The Makama Fault carries particular weight in California's broader seismic story, because it isn't an isolated, standalone feature. It's formally recognized as the northward continuation of the Hayward-Rogers Creek fault system, meaning it's directly, structurally connected to the same chain of faults that includes the Hayward's Fault, a fault running directly beneath some of the most densely populated parts of the East Bay and widely considered by seismologists to be one of the most dangerous urban fault lines in the entire country. A separate, slightly larger earthquake event in that same corridor weeks earlier had already prompted local media coverage, explicitly framing it as yet another warning sign pointing toward a Mauandatus, broader looming risk of a major rupture somewhere along this interconnected fault network, with residents describing the shaking as feeling like a freight train rolling directly through their homes. And then came the final week of July, precisely the stretch of days when the world's attention turned almost entirely toward Japan, as rescue crews in Kumamoto worked through rubble and heat to reach survivors. Trapped beneath a collapsed shopping mall, California's own network of seismic monitoring stations kept recording quietly, continuously, the same way it does every single day. And what it picked up during that exact window was a fresh cluster of small earthquakes rippling through the same general stretch of Northern California that had already been active for months. Within a span of just a day or two surrounding the Kumamoto disaster, monitoring stations logged a string of small earthquakes near Cloverdale, Geyserville, Redwood Valley, and Potter Valley, all clustered along or near that same Makama Fault corridor in Sonoma and Mendocino counties, while separately, a distinct cluster of small quakes continued rattling the area around Gilroy, along the Calaveras Fault further south in the Bay Area, and a minor magnitude 2.4 earthquake struck near Long Beach in Southern California, close to the broader San Andreas Fault System's southern reach. None of these individual events, on their own, amounted to anything close to a major disaster. Most were small enough that only sensitive instruments, and a relatively small number of nearby residents filing Did You Feel It reports with the Geological Survey, even registered them at all. But that's precisely the point seismologists have been making all year, and the reason this quiet California activity deserves attention even without a single headline, grabbing main shock attached to it. Earthquakes of this size, magnitude 1, 2, 3, occasionally ticking up into the 4 range, happen constantly throughout California. Every single day, in numbers most people never hear about because they simply don't rise to the level of national news. What made 2026 different wasn't any single earthquake. It was the sheer breadth of the activity, spread across nearly every major fault system in the state within the span of a single year. The Coachella Valley in January and February, the East Bay in early February, the Santa Cruz Mountains in April, the Brawley Seismic Zone in May, and the Makama Fault corridor recurring in June and again in late July, precisely the week the world's attention was locked onto Japan instead. This is where the broader, more sobering scientific context comes into focus, because California's seismic risk isn't simply a matter of counting how many small earthquakes happen to strike in a given year. It's about what those earthquakes might be telling researchers about the much larger, much more dangerous ruptures that these same fault systems are historically capable of producing, and that, by every measure seismologists currently have available, are considered overdue. The southern section of the San Andreas Fault, running through the desert regions near the Salton Sea and the Coachella Valley, hasn't produced a major rupture since sometime between 1680 and 1690, more than 3 centuries ago, even, though major earthquakes along that stretch of fault are estimated to occur, on average, roughly every 200 years. According to widely cited estimates, there's roughly a 20% chance of a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake striking that specific stretch of fault within the next 30 years, a genuinely significant probability for a single, specific fault segment, especially given how long it's already been sitting quiet. Further north, the Hayward Fault, that same fault system directly connected to the Makama Fault segment that rattled Sonoma County multiple times throughout 2026, carries its own sobering statistics. The most recent major earthquake along that fault struck back in 1868, registering somewhere around magnitude 6.9, and detailed paleoseismic research, studies of ancient earthquake evidence preserved in layers of sediment, has identified a dozen separate major earthquakes along that fault stretching back centuries, occurring on average once every 160 years, with the average gap between the 5 most recent events narrowing slightly to roughly 140 years. By that math, the Hayward Fault is already sitting well past its own historical average interval, prompting a formal scientific assessment concluding there's roughly a 1 in 3 chance of another surface-rupturing earthquake along that fault within the next 30 years, a sobering figure for a fault running directly beneath some of the most densely populated communities in the entire San Francisco Bay Area. Geologists have also pointed to newer, more specialized research suggesting that stress along major sections of the San Andreas system may be approaching genuinely critical levels. Patrick Abbott, a geologist and professor emeritus at San Diego State University, has pointed to research indicating that both the San Andreas and neighboring San Jacinto fault systems show signs consistent with steadily accumulating strain that sooner or later will need to be released. And UC Berkeley seismologist Roland Bergman has offered a particularly pointed assessment of exactly the kind of swarm activity California experienced throughout 2026, noting that the southern portion of the San Andreas Fault hasn't ruptured in more than 3 centuries, and is significantly overdue for a major event, and that swarms occurring close to that overdue timeline, even when they don't directly release the fault's major accumulated stress, can still meaningfully shift the surrounding stress field in ways that indicate an enhanced overall hazard. None of this amounts to a prediction that a specific catastrophic earthquake is imminent, and responsible seismologists are always careful to draw a hard line between recognizing elevated long-term risk and claiming any ability to forecast exactly when or where the next major rupture will actually occur. Modern seismology, despite genuinely impressive advances, still cannot predict earthquakes with any precision. A fact researchers repeat consistently specifically to guard against exactly the kind of fear-driven speculation that swarms and clusters like California's 2026 activities so easily invite. What seismologists can do, and what they've spent this entire year doing, is track probabilities, monitor accumulated stress across interconnected fault systems, and use every new earthquake, however small, as another data point helping to refine those probability estimates and identify which specific fault segments deserve the closest ongoing attention. That's exactly why the state has invested so heavily in California's Shake Alert early warning system, a network of hundreds of seismic sensors positioned across the state, specifically designed to detect the first, faster-traveling seismic waves generated by an earthquake and issue a warning, sometimes just seconds, but occasionally as much as a full minute before the slower, more destructive shaking waves actually arrive at a given location. Those precious seconds have already proven capable of automatically slowing trains, triggering utility shutoffs, and giving people enough warning to duck, cover, and hold on before the worst of the shaking begins. A direct, practical response to exactly the kind of long-term, statistically elevated risk that fault systems like the San Andreas and its many connected branches represent. The system exists precisely because officials understand that California's earthquake risk isn't a distant, abstract hypothetical. It's an ongoing, active feature of living in the state, one that shows up quietly in exactly the kind of scattered, easy-to-overlook activity that unfolded throughout 2026, including that final stretch of small quakes rippling through Sonoma and Mendocino counties during the very same week the world's attention was fixed entirely on the tragedy unfolding in Japan. It's worth pausing to appreciate just how carefully California's scientific community has worked to quantify all of this, because the state's earthquake risk isn't simply a matter of vague anecdotal concern passed down from one generation of geologists to the next. Since 2003, teams of researchers working under a collaborative framework known as the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast have produced increasingly detailed, statistically rigorous models estimating the probability of major earthquakes striking specific fault segments across the state over rolling 30-year windows. The most recent versions of that forecast put the overall probability of at least one magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake striking somewhere in the greater San Francisco Bay Area at somewhere around 70% within the coming 3 decades, a figure assembled by combining data from dozens of individual fault segments, including the Hayward, Rogers Creek, Makama, Calaveras, and San Andreas faults, each contributing its own individual probability to that larger combined regional risk. Southern California carries its own comparably serious figures, driven primarily by the long overdue Southern San Andreas Fault and its neighboring San Jacinto Fault, both of which factor heavily into similar long-term forecasts, covering the Los Angeles Basin and the broader Inland Empire region. These forecasts exist precisely because relying on memory, headlines, or gut instinct simply isn't a reliable way to understand a hazard that unfolds across timescales spanning centuries. The famous 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the one that ruptured the exact same stretch of San Andreas Fault running through the Santa Cruz Mountains near Boulder Creek, remains, even after more than a century, the benchmark against which every subsequent California earthquake gets measured. A magnitude 7.9 event that leveled large portions of San Francisco and killed an estimated 3,000 people. That single earthquake released so much accumulated stress along that particular stretch of fault that it actually appears to have delayed subsequent major ruptures in that specific segment for decades afterward. Part of why paleoseismic researchers pay such close attention to exactly how long it's been since each individual fault segment last released its own built-up strain, since a fault that ruptured relatively recently in geological terms, behaves very differently from one that's been silently accumulating stress for 3 or 4 centuries without releasing any of it. That same logic drove one of the most ambitious and ultimately most humbling scientific experiments in the history of American seismology, centered on a small, unassuming stretch of the San Andreas Fault running through the town of Parkfield, roughly halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Beginning in the 1980s, seismologists identified Parkfield as a section of fault that appeared to rupture in moderate earthquakes with unusual regularity, roughly every 22 years based on the historical record, and organized an elaborate, heavily instrumented long-term monitoring effort specifically designed to catch the section's next expected earthquake in the act, deploying dense networks of sensors intended to capture every possible precursor signal in the days, hours, and minutes leading up to the anticipated rupture. The Parkfield earthquake researchers were confidently expecting did eventually arrive in 2004, but it came years later than the original forecast window predicted, and despite the unprecedented density of instrumentation surrounding the fault at the time, it arrived without any of the clear, unambiguous precursor signals scientists had hoped to identify. The experiment stands today as one of the clearest, most direct demonstrations that, even with extraordinary resources and decades of focused attention on a single, well-studied fault segment, reliably predicting the precise timing of an earthquake remains firmly beyond the reach of current science, a humbling lesson that continues to shape how seismologists talk about swarms, clusters, and elevated risk today, always in terms of probability and statistical likelihood, never in terms of specific predicted dates. That hard-won humility is exactly why California's approach to earthquake risk has increasingly shifted toward building resilience and rapid response capability, rather than chasing the elusive goal of prediction. Beyond the Shake Alert early warning network, the state has spent decades steadily strengthening building codes, retrofitting vulnerable older structures, particularly unreinforced masonry buildings, and older concrete parking structures known to perform poorly during strong shaking and running. Regular public earthquake drills, including the annual Great California Shakeout, in which millions of residents practice the same basic drop, cover, and hold-on response that emergency officials say remains the single most effective immediate action anyone can take the moment shaking besoin. In essence, none of these measures can prevent a major earthquake from happening, but together they represent California's practical evidence-based answer to a hazard that scientists can quantify with impressive precision in terms of long-term probability, even while remaining fundamentally unable to say with any confidence which specific day, week, or year that probability will finally resolve into an actual ground-shaking event. That tension between statistically well-understood long-term risk and genuinely irreducible short-term uncertainty is precisely what makes a year like 2026 so quietly significant for the scientists tracking it, even without a single dramatic main shock to anchor the story. Every earthquake logged throughout the year, from the Coachella Valley in January to the Makama Fault Corridor in late July. Or adds another small data point to models that researchers will keep refining for years, even decades to come. Models built not to predict the next major California earthquake with any specific certainty, but to help the state understand, as clearly and honestly as the available science allows, just how much stress continues to accumulate along its most dangerous fault lines, and just how overdue several of those fault segments already appear to be by any reasonable historical measure. Japan's Kumamoto earthquake delivered its damage suddenly, violently, and completely undeniably. A single magnitude 6.8 rupture that collapsed buildings, triggered evacuations for hundreds of thousands of people, and claimed dozens of lives within a matter of seconds. California's seismic story throughout that SAO. Meat period unfolded in almost the opposite fashion, spread out across an entire year, scattered across a dozen different towns and fault segments, made up almost entirely of earthquakes too small individually to generate anything beyond a brief, forgettable news mention, if they generated any coverage at all. And yet, from a purely scientific standpoint, both stories are ultimately telling researchers the same underlying truth, that the tectonic plates responsible for shaping both regions are locked in a slow, relentless, ongoing struggle, one that periodically breaks loose in sudden headline-generating catastrophe. And that spends far more of its time expressing itself quietly, incrementally, through the kind of scattered, easy-to-miss activity that rarely makes it past a local news brief, if it makes the news at all. There's also something worth sitting with in the contrast itself, between the two disasters unfolding on opposite sides of the Pacific during that same narrow window of time. For the millions of people living across California, that quieter version of the story carries its own kind of weight precisely because it's so easy to overlook. A magnitude 2.4 earthquake near Long Beach doesn't interrupt anyone's morning commute. A handful of magnitude 1 and 2 tremors scattered across Sonoma County's wine country barely register as more than a passing curiosity for anyone who happens to notice the alert on their phone. But collectively, across an entire year, spread across nearly every major fault segment the state has to offer, from the Coachella Valley to the Bay Area to the Salton Sea to the rolling hills of Mendocino County, that scattered activity represents a state whose underlying tectonic engine never actually stopped running throughout 2026, even during the exact stretch of days when every camera, every headline, and every ounce of global attention was pointed 6,000 miles away, toward the wreckage of a very different earthquake, on a very different island, on the opposite side of an ocean that happens to connect two of the most seismically active regions on the entire planet. Both Japan and California sit along different stretches of the same broader tectonic system that geologists collectively call the Pacific Ring of Fire, a horseshoe-shaped belt of fault lines and volcanic activity that traces almost the entire rim of the Pacific Ocean, responsible for the overwhelming majority of the world's earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Japan sits atop a genuinely complex tangle of subduction zones, where entire tectonic plates are being forced beneath one another, producing some of the most powerful earthquakes on the planet. California's risk comes from a different kind of boundary, a transform fault system. Imagine where two plates grind past each other horizontally rather than one sliding beneath the other. But the underlying driver in both cases is the same relentless engine of plate tectonics, slowly, patiently reshaping the surface of the planet, one earthquake, one swarm, one overlooked headline at a time.